So I think we're going to just take a little a time to refresh where we're at and talk about just kind of recapping what we did last week, which is looking at the tables, the tax tables for both employee and employer. So first off, why are we talking about these two different columns, employee taxes and employer taxes? What does that even mean?
Who contributes?
Yeah, who's paying it, right? So you pay some taxes as the employee, yeah? And then your employer pays some taxes out of his or her pocket, right? How many taxes do we pay? 4. How many does the employer pay? 4. So when you're asked to recreate this matrix, that's the first thing you know is how many frickin' things have to go in the matrix, right? Okay. So the easiest thing and then there's 3 things basically you need to know about each tax, right? What are they? Without looking at the table, I want you as much as possible to reconstruct this from your head. You need to know what the name of the tax is.
The percentage.
You need to know what the rate is. And you need to know the cap. Very good. I find it easiest when I'm reconstructing this table to the first 2 to be the ones that are similar for both. In other words, taxes that both the employee and employer pay. So and you guys, honestly, it's been all the way since Thursday, so you're going to have to reintroduce yourself. I promise at some point I will remember. I'm going to try. Starts with a C. Colby? No.
No, it starts with an E.
Help me out.
Alec.
Golly. Yep, not even close. Same part of the alphabet. Does that count? Can you name one of the taxes that both an employee and an employer pay?
Health insurance.
Okay, great. Actually, it's called hospital insurance, HI. I'm going to put it number 2 because I'm just going to keep them in the same order as we've got them on the table. And what do we call in just our modern day language, what do we call HI? Medicare, yeah. Okay. Mallory, what's the percentage for HI? Great. So it's a really small tax, right? That's the cap. No cap. And what does that mean when I say there's no cap?
No matter how high your income is.
Yeah, whether I make 10 grand or 10 million, I pay 1.45%. My boss matches 1.45%. We do have an asterisk on this guy, don't we? We have something special to consider. Okay. What is that? Corey, Cody. Is there anybody in here named Corey or Cody? No. Okay. That must be my other class. Okay. What's the asterisk? Okay. Oh, I didn't put an asterisk on the sheet?
No.
Okay. Well, then throw an asterisk on that thing because there needs to be one. I'll give you a little hint, Spencer. There's a tax that we talked about that pays for, partially funds the Affordable Care Act. For people that are kind of high income, they've got to pay an additional. Ring a bell?
It does,
But not enough of a bell that it's a clear bell.
200 is single or 250 is married.
Okay, is that the tax or the what? What's that?
Wage. Salary, I think. Or it
If you
goes into
earn $200,000 or more a year and you're single, or go ahead, close.
250
$250 if
if you're married.
you're married filing joint. Then you pay what? An extra 0.9%. And here's the kicker. Your employer doesn't match it, it's only you. Let me say that again. So this number becomes what? 2.35. This number stays 1.45. Okay, I think that's been a law maybe 24 months or something like that. Okay, great. Ha! That was what I was thinking. You didn't raise your hand when I said, is there a Colby or a, but it wasn't actually exactly right, was it? Okay. Do you remember what this other part of this, so this tax is, let me ask you a question first. This tax is part of an overall program called what? There's two taxes that's part of the big umbrella guy called what? That's the other tax. Anybody remember what the umbrella is? FICA. FICA is the law that sets up these two taxes, right? Now you can go ahead and finish that out. You started it. OA.
SDI,
Yeah? Do you remember what it stands for?
old age, survival, disability.
Excellent. Old age survivors and disability insurance. Perfect. Do you remember the percentage? Don't look at Spencer.
3.1?
No.
6.2?
Yep. And your name? Daniel. Is there a cap?
There is.
There is a cap on OASDI. Remember what it is? Roughly? I honestly don't. I can't tell you off the top of my head because it changes every year and we're only in January. It's 118 something. 118.5. And the thing is, once you get it written down, you don't need to think anymore. You just write it again. It's exactly the same on the employer side. Okay, excellent. You've got half the chart filled out. Connor, what else does an employee have to worry about?
Federal income tax?
Okay. And what are the rates?
10.39.
That's very, very close. If you're pretty low income, I think up to like 10 grand if you're single, up to like 20 grand if you're married filing joint, you pay 10%. Then the next chunk of income you pay 15% on. Then the next chunk, 25, 28, 33, 36, and 39.6. We have 7 different pockets of marginal tax rates. So the highest one is 39.6. Okay? And you don't get there until you're single and make like 300 or married filing joint make like $500,000. Is there a cap? There is not a cap. Carlos, what is my last employee? Yeah. Now, does every state have state income tax? No, I think there's like 8 states that don't. In Montana, do you remember what the range is? Yeah. Yep. Is there a cap? No. Okay, Klaus, what else do we have for employer taxes?
FUTA,
FUTA, what does that stand for?
Federal Unemployment Tax Act,
Federal Unemployment Tax Act, and what's the percentage?
0.6.
Barely nothing. Is there a cap?
7 grand.
So every year, I only pay 0.6% on the first $7,000 that I pay each of you. If you come to work for me in November and I only pay you $1,500, I only pay 0.6 of $1,500. If you come to work for me and I pay you $100,000, I only pay 0.6% on the first $7,000. Right? And Rebecca, what's the last tax?
Pseudo.
Yeah. And these rates aren't engraved in stone, but they're about what to what?
1 to 6.1%.
Yeah, 1 to like 6%, I think is what I said. Some people that have been in business forever and have zero turnover, their percentage is as low as like 0.1%. Okay? So, and what's the cap this year?
31.4.
31.4. Okay. You will need to be able to replicate this out of your head. Also, I think I asked you to start studying the acronyms, so I would be working on that. Did I give you the date for the quiz? That'll be a week from today on this and the acronyms. Okay, and we're going to learn some more acronyms in this chapter. With that, let's go ahead and get started on Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is on computing wages and salaries. We can't start to figure out the taxes until we start to figure out how to calculate wages. This is going to be the first chapter, and the first half of it is spent kind of introducing theory and models and blah, 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 and then we'll get out our pencils and calculators and paper and do some calculations. Okay, this should look familiar. What's the acronym for this again? What do we call it? FLSA. And basically what this is all saying is a fancy way of saying that when the FLSA was promulgated, which is a fancy word for put out there, when the FLSA was promulgated, it was intended to cover only companies that were engaged in interstate commerce, meaning the products cross over state lines, either the raw material coming in or the final product going out. And many nonprofits are covered, and also companies with 500,000 or more in gross sales. Additionally, the FLSA applies to individuals that work for a company that might not comply with that prior slide. In other words, I don't have $500,000 in gross revenue. I only sell $110,000 a year of huckleberry flavored jam. But I individually am in a fringe occupation. So, for example, I'm a trucker, and I drive the product that goes across the state line. But our revenues aren't at $500,000. So I'm in a fringe occupation, so I'm individually covered. The long and the short of it is how you can interpret all this is many organizations are covered by the FLSA, but lots of small little family businesses aren't. So what are the ramifications of that? Like, what does the FLSA say? That we've got to do what and what?
Minimum wage.
Got to pay minimum wage.
Hours worked.
Got to pay overtime. Can't violate child labor laws. But there's companies that are exempt from the FLSA. So they don't have to comply with minimum wage or overtime. They do have to comply with federal or with child labor laws, because that's also civil rights law. But, I mean, and you're not going to probably be able to get anybody below minimum wage, but you actually don't have to comply with it if you don't meet those first two screens, i.e. enterprise coverage or individual coverage. This I'm not going to spend a ton of time. It's employer and employee, and the only thing that I want to just point out here is we need to start to differentiate in our mind the difference between an employee and an independent contractor. And I'm not going to get too deep into it now, but does anyone want to just kind of venture a guess or give me their impression of what the difference is between an employee and an independent contractor?
Well, an employee is where you work for somebody, and an independent contractor is where you're contracted out to do a job. So it's actually your business.
Okay, so you're saying you own your own business,
Right.
and you go and you bid on a job, and that makes you a contractor. Right. Okay, that's a piece of it. It really mostly has to do with how much control the person has over you. So if they can tell you when to come to work and how to do the job and what tools to use and what procedures and policies to accomplish your tasks in your job, you're probably an employee. If you come and say, I'm going to bid on, converting all of your computers to Windows 10, or I'm going to install all new Macs, and I'm going to charge you $300 a computer to do that, you're not going to tell me how to do that, are you? You're just gonna say, that's great, once it's all tested, call me in, I'll do a quality control walkthrough, and then I'll pay your invoice. Okay, that's more of a contractor. Okay, the Fair Labor Standards Act very clearly has specific laws that identify how we treat domestic help. I don't know about you guys, but at night when I go home, I've got my staff, right? I've got my chef and my gardener and my nanny. I'm kidding. That's domestic help. And many people do have that kind of stuff. Not so much in Missoula, Montana, but I've got a sister-in-law and brother-in-law that live in Manhattan, and that's very much a part of their lives. They have staffs, okay? That's domestic help. Does domestic help need to be paid minimum wage? If they comply with the FLSA?
Yes.
Sure. They have to be paid overtime?
Yes.
Sure. You got to cut them a W-2 at the end of the year? You bet. You got to pay workers' comp on them? Absolutely. Okay. In other words, domestic help is everybody that works in your home, and these people have got to be treated just like any other employee under FLSA. They qualify as officially as domestic help is covered under the FLSA if you pay them at least $2,000 in a calendar year and they work regularly over 8 hours a week. Okay. So it's not like, we have the first Friday of every month's date night and we have somebody come watch our kids. That's not staff. That's not domestic help. You can pay them whatever you want. You don't have to come and cut them a W-2. But if you've got somebody that regularly works in your home or staff's part of the backfill of your life, you've got to comply with all this. The exception is live-in domestics do not need to be paid overtime. So if you have like an au pair that lives in your home, you don't need to pay them overtime because it's very hard to differentiate what on time and off time is. Okay, that's the key part there. This, and by the way, this is a fairly this is not enforced as often as it should be. There's thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of domestic workers in this country that are not paid minimum wage, that are not paid overtime, that are not cut W-2s for a variety of reasons. But you're violating the law if you don't do it. What's federal minimum wage right now?
Something an hour, 8.15 maybe? I don't know.
$7.25.
$7.25 an hour.
Wow.
Montana minimum wage? $8.05 an hour. It was $7.85. It just went up 20 cents. If your state has a higher minimum wage than federal, you've got to pay the higher. If your state has a lower minimum wage, which a couple states in the Deep South do, you've got to pay federal. Okay, so in other words, you've got to pay whichever is higher of the two. Okay, what's included in minimum wage? Well, obviously it's your regular wage rate, but it's all this stuff too, like your commissions are included in there. Non-discretionary bonuses. What's a non-discretionary bonus? Any ideas?
Everyone gets it.
Yeah, and everyone gets it, and it's not so much that everyone gets it, it's that it is tied to like performance. Like if we hit 98% or 2% or less defective rate, everybody gets $100 this month. Okay, that's written right into the union contract. It's non-discretionary. Then that $100 for that month is included in the calculation to see if I paid you overtime. Versus, hey, you guys, I just ran my P&L for this month. We had a really great month. I'm giving you guys all $100. That's discretionary. You're not planning on it. It's not a part of your pay package. Then I can't include that when I go and run my numbers to make sure I'm paying you minimum wage. Do you need another example, or do you understand the difference between non-discretionary and discretionary?
Can you give it?
Sure. So a non-discretionary bonus is your pay package is I pay you 16 cents per unit that you run through quality control. And I also, if we identify, if we put 1,000 units a week through the line, then you get another $55. That's non-discretionary. Okay, it's written into the compensation package, and if you guys hit that 1,000 units, I can't say, I don't really have the money or I don't feel like paying it because it's part of your package. I don't have a choice, I have to pay it. Versus some sort of profit sharing, where I take a peek once a month or once a quarter and I'm like, you did a great job, or we're not performing up to snuff, and I do or don't give you money based on that. Okay, so, and that's basically what this says. Non-discretionary is included in your calculation of minimum wage. Discretionary bonuses are not. So that extra money I give you once a quarter, I can't put that into my calculation to make sure I'm getting you $8.05 an hour. Okay, and then there's this whole other slew of things that I don't include when I'm looking at minimum wage. So, okay, great, you achieve this certain level of performance, and I give you a certificate for a massage or a dinner out or a weekend up the Sealy Swan at the Double Arrow or something. Okay, those are gifts to reward you for your service, but I can't include that in your minimum wage calculations. Profit sharing I've already talked about. Any of these quote-unquote PTOs, sick pay, vacation pay, holiday pay, or if I give you an allowance for driving your car or buying special uniforms, or you're my mechanic and I give you a tool allowance, none of that can be calculated in minimum wage. Okay. So we just talked about what minimum wage is, and then there's certain exceptions. Training, if you work in a penal institution, if you're a student that's studying in higher ed and you're learning a trade like our culinary folks out here, we don't actually do this, but we could pay them 85% of minimum wage to work the cafeteria, okay, because they're learning. So there are exceptions to minimum wage, just be aware of that. Can anybody identify for me what the difference between a minimum wage and a living wage is? Anyone know? Anyone heard the term living wage? You're shaking your head. What is it?
Living wage is how much money you actually have to make to be able to afford the goods and services necessary for it.
Precisely. So to recap, for those of you listening on tape, when I posed the question, Connor responded, living wage is the amount that you have to make to be able to purchase the goods and services in the market in which you live. So I think I told you one of my sons lives in San Francisco. Living wage, take a guess. Anybody been to San Francisco? No? $22.65 an hour. Living wage. That's the minimum amount you need. And believe me, that is not buying you some upscale life there. That is the minimum amount you need to purchase the goods and services in that market. We did Missoula County. I don't know if it was Western Montana or Missoula County. I think it was just Missoula County in 2008. So that's really dated now. It's 9 years old. And back then it was $11.50 an hour. Living wage. Okay. We voted on it as a county, and it did not pass. How could that happen? Who would possibly vote against a living wage? What would be the counter argument? Small businesses what? Small businesses can't afford to pay it. Some work's not worth it. If I've got to pay you $11.50 an hour as my barista, guess what a cup of coffee is going to cost? Huh? Oh, that's a kind of a loaded statement. What do you mean a moral hazard? Okay. And so what's the moral piece of that?
That it implies that your value
Well, it's not arbitrary because the $11.25 an hour is calculated as the base minimum you have to make to be able to live here. So that is, that's been,
It implies that some work is worth value.
okay, all right, great. Way to extrapolate your thoughts. So there's a lot of controversy about it. Conversely, if you don't make living wage, guess what? We all pay for you. How do we do that? We pay because we give you Section 8 vouchers, and we cover your daycare, and we pay for your health care costs because you can't afford health insurance, and you show up in the ER when you could have just gotten your teeth cleaned. So, I mean, it gets paid for one way or the other, right? So the controversy isn't does it get paid for or not, it's how do we do it, right? And for a lot of people, those sort of hidden costs seem less overt than other costs. Okay, what does this thing want me to do? Don't show this message again. So we didn't pass it in Western Montana. It's in, I think, like maybe 100, 150 communities around the world, in the country right now, living wage ordinances. Now, here's the other misconception. Living wage does not apply to all companies. It only applies, what does this say, 100 plus cities. It only applies to businesses that have contracts with the government. So the argument that, it's gonna, and those are good arguments if it was but the argument that it's gonna pass through to all of our goods and services, or it's gonna put small businesses up, that means you don't really understand how living wage works. Living wage is, I'm an asphalt company, and I have a contract with the state of Montana. Or I'm a home health aid company, and I've got a contract with Missoula County, right? So I've got some sort of contractual relationship with a government entity. Some states now, though, are including private industry. It's expanding to include private industry. Question?
I was just saying, would that go with railroad work too?
So railroads, I believe, I honestly don't know that much about it, but I think that they contract with lots of private containers and logistics companies, right? But I would assume some of those customers are government entities. Yeah? So then sure. Yep. Okay. So this is an important concept. You should all be able to identify what living wage is. And I'd like you to think a little bit about how you, just based on this very short conversation we had, how you feel about it, if you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. There's a lot of conversation. What is that? Oh. Somebody with a boombox sitting right outside the door. There was a lot of conversation during the election of raising our federal minimum wage to $15 over a, 3 to 5 year time span, I believe. Seattle has done it. $15 an hour, baseline minimum wage for anything, including private industry in Seattle. The one thing you didn't identify, what happens when you raise your minimum wage to $15 an hour? All in one step. Huh? Yeah, and that's a good thing for the state, right? Everybody's paying more taxes, right? So my tax base goes up. But it's called wage compression. So before minimum wage got raised to $15 an hour, I made $18 an hour as your supervisor. And you made $9 an hour. Now you're making $15 an hour, I'm making $18 an hour, our wages are compressed. I'm like, dude, I want $23 an hour. I'm supervising a $15 an hour person now. So it's not just, it doesn't just apply generally to the wage class you're talking about. Okay. Tipped employees. Now, first off, let me just tell you, in Montana, none of this holds true, because in Montana, even if you're a tipped employee, guess what you have to be paid? $8.05 an hour. That is not true in most states. Like, almost no other state has that law. In most states, you have to be paid $2.13 an hour, and then your customers can make up that other $6 an hour to get you to $8.05.
What if you don't get tips? Like the customers will pay this much?
So we're going to talk about that. Basically, yeah, so good question. You're like, I'm making $2.13 an hour, but I work in a coffee shop where they leave me 50 cents under my coffee cup, right? You actually can petition the government to change the tip credit for your employer. So what your employer has to do once a week, I don't know if it's once a week, it's once a month, is run a tape on your gross sales. So I'm a bartender and you're a barista and he waits tables. What else is regularly tipped? Bartenders, baristas, huh? Servers, maitre d's. Rafting guides. You know, I don't know if you could never get away with paying a rafting guide less than minimum wage, could you? No, I don't think so. No. Yeah, they would be a very safe rafting guide, probably. But yeah, okay, like outfitters, rafting guides, you know, anybody like that, backcountry guides. But anybody that's regularly tipped, once a month you have to run a tape of what their revenues were. So how much liquor did I sell? How much food did you sell? How much coffee did you pump? And then you have to prove that they reported at least 8% of that. Okay. And if that, oh, Carlos isn't here now, but I was just going to tell him, if that 8% doesn't come to the difference between $2.13 and minimum wage, then you can petition. Okay, so let's dig into these numbers a little bit more. So first off, a tipped employee is identified as somebody who regularly averages more money, or more than $30 a month in tips. So if you're somebody that like, you know, somebody came up to me after class, that was a great lecture, here's $20. That does not make me a tipped employee, right? You've got to be regularly tipped month after month more than $30. Okay, so minimum tipped wage, right? So we've been talking about minimum wage itself is $7.25 an hour. Minimum tipped wage is $2.13 an hour. So somewhere along the line, I've got to show that my people get another $5.12 an hour, because $2.13 and $5.12 equal what? $7.25, which is federal minimum wage, right? That $5.12 an hour is called a tip credit, and the employer gets a tip credit. In other words, I don't have to pay you $7.25 an hour. I have a tip credit of $5.12 an hour. Again, not in Montana, so let's just use Idaho. Okay. So what happens is, in any situation, how much do you have to make a week under federal minimum wage? $290, right? The tip credit, okay, that doesn't matter. The tip credit remains the same. Let's get a little bit too into the trees. We need to see the forest right now. So what they're saying here is we've got a gal that works 47 hours a week at the Christchurch bar as a tipped employee, and she averages $750 a week in tips. How much is her gross pay from her employer? Based upon what I've told you, see if you can pencil this out, and don't bring it up on your screen. How much, just run a quick calculation for me, how much does the Christchurch bar have to pay her? She made $750 a week in tips last week. And they're running her gross paycheck for a week. How much do they have to pay her? How much? Nope, because
$85.
they get a tip credit. How much?
$85.20.
That's it. That's their gross paycheck to her, $85.20, which is $2.13 times 40. That's all they got to pay her.
She makes more in tips than she makes in...
Okay, oh, I'm sorry. She worked overtime. Plus, she gets her additional 7 hours. So, in the $7.25, how do you get the $10.88? Where does that come from? Yep. Yep. So that's your minimum wage times 1.5. The tip credit remains the same. Do you want to try another one of these? Okay. So let's say, anytime when I put up a calculation, if you're like, can we do another one, just, I can tell that you need another one because everyone's going. But if you weren't doing that, you would have to tell me, like, we need to do another one. Okay, so first off, I want you to write down on your piece of paper 3 things. Fill in 3 blanks for me. How much is this? Second thing I want you to write down for me is what's first write down those 3 numbers, and then I'll give you a problem.
Are we making them up?
No, there's not a creative answer. You know what the minimum wage is for Fed.
Oh, okay, so, okay. I was just looking at it.
Go ahead, you can ask another question.
Is the minimum wage rate? Is it from this?
It is. Yeah, it's from the slide, yeah.
512?
No, that's the tip credit. Okay. Alec, what's minimum wage?
$7.25.
Daniel, what's minimum tipped wage?
$2.13.
Jonathan, what's the difference between these two?
$5.
And what is that term?
Tip credit.
And what does that mean, Katie? What's a tip credit? If you were explaining it to me, I'm looking to start a brewery and I don't know what a tip credit is. Well, not what I have to make up. Bingo. You would tell me if I said to you, you're my bookkeeper, I'm going to start a little brewery in, Boise, you're going to say, I'm going to say, well, what is all these different numbers? And you're going to say, well, you only have to pay them $2.13 an hour, Lisa. And I'd say, but wait, minimum wage is $7.25. And you're going to tell me, yeah, but you get a tip credit of $5.12 an hour. But you've got to make sure what? What do I have to make sure of? Can I just assume they're getting that? No, I have to prove that they're getting it, or I've got to make up the difference. Because ultimately, you guys, I have to do what? Make sure they get $7.25 an hour. I've got to pay them this, and I'm sure the heck hoping that my customers pay them this. But if they don't, I've got to backfill it.
Is this predicated on the person also reporting the tips not getting back to the employer by reporting?
Yes, but if they chronically are under-reporting the tips, they're going to fill out, I can't remember the form that Carlos was asking about to get recompense from it. And the other thing is you're shooting yourself in the foot because then your employer's not matching your FICA if you don't report your tips accurately. Okay, so what's total minimum wage for a 40-hour week then? $2.90. Okay, once I hit 40 hours a week, last question, how much do you have to pay me? If I make minimum wage, how much do you have to pay me an hour? Once I get to 40 hours. So calculate that number and let's plug it in. 1088. 725 times 1.5. Alrighty. So let's try one. Oh, and just as a reminder, you guys, once I get over 40 hours, right, now all of a sudden you've got to pay me this, correct? Does my tip credit go up or is it still $5.12 an hour? It's still $5.12 an hour. Okay, try this. You can just write down these facts so you can go and check them out later. I work I'm going to use Tower Pizza because they're closing, which is the saddest thing ever. Oh, I can't use Tower Pizza because that's in Montana. Let's say there's one in Washington. Earns $410 in tips. How much does Tower Pizza have to cut her for a check for gross pay? How much does Tower Pizza have to cut her for a check for gross pay? And please write it all out, the algebraic statement. I don't want you to just do it on your calculator. Always write out your full algebra. The first 40 hours, you can back out the tip credit and pay your 7 1/4. The last 6 hours, she's got to make time and a half, but you can still subtract the tip credit. And always use a pencil. Don't bring a pen to this class. Always use a pencil. So the first 40 hours I pay her $213, right? And we know that number. We don't even have to calculate it after we practiced it a few times. That's always going to be $85.20. The next 6 hours I've got to pay her $10.88 an hour, right? Because she's hit overtime. I still get to subtract the tip credit, don't I? No, that's not right. I've got to put that inside the parentheses, my bad. So that's the amount of the gross paycheck I'm going to cut her, right? That's also, I didn't even have to run the numbers because I can see that $410 for 1 week more than made up for that $5.12 an hour. What if I had told you that she made $41 in tips all week? Now what's your concern? Can you pay her $213 an hour? Why not? Do me the math and show me why you can't pay her $213 an hour if she made $41 in tips. And specifically contrast it with what she has to get in a week. You need to show me why I can't just pay her $213 an hour if she only got 41 bucks in tips. Because she's got to make a certain amount for the full week. We've done that number up there. You ran that with one of the first 3 numbers. I think. Yeah, we've got that number up there. You should just be able to pull it from what we already did. $2.13 an hour plus the tips is less than how much? What does she have to make? Yeah. You can't pay her $2.13 an hour. You can't take the whole tip credit because your customers did not backfill $5.12 an hour, did they? Not even close. Okay. Questions on the math? And again, I'm taping this, and then I'll get a YouTube URL, and then I post that into Moodle. So if you want to rehear this, you can do that. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. You can move it into what you want to hear.
So, so then that adds up to like 89 cents an hour in tip credit. So
Right.
You just subtract 89 cents from
I wouldn't do it like that. Okay, so your question now is how much do they have to pay her?
per hour.
Okay. Can somebody help Katie with that? How are you going to do the math on that? She wants to know how much do I have to pay her an hour? I would first just see what I need to pay her in total.
So you have to pay her $4.23 additional to that $2.30.
How much do I have to pay her in total? At least. What does she have to make bare minimum?
You guys make $2.90.
Okay.
You're taking 41 away from $2.90. You're getting $2.59.
$2.49. I've got to pay her $2.49. That's all you need to know. If you want to get it down to the hourly, divide by 40. Was that the number you came up with?
Plus 85.20, yes.
622.
So you're paying your base of 85.20, you're going plus 163.8 deficit.
249 minus 85.2 divided by 40. I can't do a calculator today, but you get the math. So 249 is what I've got to pay her. I already know I've got to pay her this note regardless. So whatever this is, that's the additional, 163.80. Question?
No, this process it all right now.
No, go ahead, ask a question.
It's fine,
The key is that you get, go ahead. The key is that you get the numbers down. Or if it's going too fast, what do you set time aside to do tonight? You've got to go re-listen to the section of the tape. Okay? Go ahead, ma'am.
Well, I just took the difference of the 290 of the 41 minus 85.2. Is that right?
Yes, totally.
So the gross pay, do you subtract that from per check or just the tips?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
You know, like the gross pay that we calculated,
Which one?
like in the
This
119
X?
No, the
119.
119.7 for the.
This one?
Yeah.
That is her gross paycheck. That's how much I cut her a check for.
Also, you subtract that from her actual.
No, this is actually her gross pay.
Or
She made up for the rest of it in tips.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so let's go back and look at this. Okay, let's look at this guy. He works, again, I don't know who works 40 hours a week and only makes $43 in tips. That would be, that wouldn't even be a barista. I don't know. You must just really suck at what you do if you're only making $43 a week in tips. But, maybe say you're like I don't know, I can't even make something up. You're a dog clipper, okay? And so the first calculation you have to run is right here, isn't it? Did they get to $290? No. Now I've got a problem as an employer, don't I? Now we have to do the calculation, how much do I need to make up? Now she's got to get to $290. She only made $43 in tips. I've got to pay her this. I knew I already had to pay her this regardless. So this number would be called additional wages, right? Because the 85.20 is stone cold regardless. Now you fast forward and I work at the Bellagio in Vegas and I make $3,000 a week. or $1,189. Obviously, I'm making $290 a week. All you do is cut her a check for this. But you don't cut her a check for that. That's the gross. You got to subtract all the taxes, so obviously she's going to get zero. And she's going to owe a bunch of money because she doesn't have enough gross wages to eat up all of her federal income tax bill, right? Right? Because what does she have to pay tax on? She's got to pay tax on $1,274, right? Because your tips are taxable. Is $85 enough to soak up 7.65% Social Security and Medicare and then federal income tax? Of course not. She's not going to get a paycheck, and she's going to have to make estimated tax payments. Okay, which is one of the things that always, I spent a summer working in Salt Lake Tahoe between my first and second year at grad school. And I was probably the only accountant sloughing drinks at whatever the hell that was, Bennigan's or something that I worked at. And I knew what was going on, so every night I would diligently, take my 22% and put it in a little pot, and then I had my money to pay my estimated taxes. Well, I can tell you I was the only person doing that. And so at the end of the year, all these other college kids are like, holy crap, I owe $2,000 in taxes, Okay, overtime. Overtime, obviously, you pay over 40 hours a week. You've got to pay 1.5 times. You can pay more than that if you want. You can pay me double time or 2.5 or whatever, but you only have to pay me 1.5. The other thing that the FLA says about this is that you've got to have 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. In other words, you can't jack around the work week to try and keep people from paying overtime, or to try and get out from underneath paying overtime. You've got to set a work week and keep it standardized. Your employer can make you work overtime. Hey, I work in I print, bulletins for churches, and turns out every Saturday is our rush day. So maybe you've got a 9-hour day on Saturday, so I can require that you work overtime. But I've got to pay you for it, obviously. Comp time. Has anybody ever heard of this? Comp time? Compensatory time off. It is probably one of the more abused or maligned workplace issues that I've ever heard of. People say, well, I'm going to work you 50 hours this week and then give you comp time next week. So you only have to come in 30 hours. Can you do that? Absolutely not. That is illegal under the Fair Labor Standard Act if you are a non-exempt employee. Write that down in big letters in your notes. Non-exempt employee. The Fair Labor Standard Act differentiates between an exempt and a non-exempt employee. Non-exempt means you are not exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. You are not exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. In other words, you've got to pay me overtime. So you can say to me, hey, Lisa, you got to work 50 hours this week, and then you only have to work 30 hours next week, but you've still got to pay me overtime for 10 hours this week. Okay? There is no such thing as comp time for non-exempt employees. Exempt employees, you can do that. Well, what's an exempt employee? Exempt means you're exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standard Act. But you are only exempt if you're one of these things. You're a white-collar worker, and they're very specific in Figure 2.2 as to what that is. I would highly encourage you to take a good hard look at Figure 2.2. You are an executive, an administrator, or a professional, which means, and this is the buzzword, that you have discretionary power in your job. Discretionary power in your job. In other words, you can figure out how to do it. So they say to me, here's your teaching schedule. They don't tell me, like, make a syllabus. Make a plan. Choose your software. Review books. I have discretionary power how I do my job. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, I mean, I'm just putting this up here in a bulleted list, but this is probably an 800-page piece of law that goes in and spends pages defining what an administrator and executive is. Here's where the problem comes. I hire you to, file and run the mail to the mailbox and keep my calendar and greet people coming in the door. But I call you chief administrator, and I put you on salary for $1,200 a month, and I work you 60 hours a week. Is he exempt or non-exempt? He's non-exempt. It doesn't matter what you call him. I can call him Lord of the Universe. But if his job description is non-discretionary, which what I just described was, keep my calendar, go to the mail, go to the bank, right, greet people. He doesn't have discretion in how he does his job. And he doesn't make $455 a week, wherever that is. Okay, this has already come and gone. This has been overturned by federal judges already. As of December 1st, that number that forever was $455 a week went to $913, and it's already been overturned. So just scratch that. That's not true. Government agencies, certainly. Certainly. Fair Labor Standards Act. Computer professionals, creative professionals, outside salespeople as well are exempt. So when we start going through, which I really want to get to, we've got to get going on some of these calculations. So here's figure 2.2. This is the one I want you to look at. It defines each of these categories we just looked at. What is a creative professional? What is an executive? You see the word discretion, discretion, discretion. Blue-collar workers are always entitled to overtime. Cops, EMTs, firefighters, paramedics. And the key here, which is where so many employers are misconceive the notion of what exempt versus non-exempt means, if I put you on salary, that does not make you exempt. Like I gave you an example of what I did with Spencer, and I hire him, and he's not an exempt employee, but I call him one, and I put him on salary, and I work him 60 hours a week. Heck no. He needs to call the Department of Labor and Industry and file a wage claim for all his back overtime. Okay? But what Spencer's going to want to do if he finds himself in that position is very clearly document his hours so that when we get to court, he's got his ducks in a row. Does anybody ask exempt employees how many hours a week they work? No. Does the university ask me, hey, Lisa, how many hours did you work last week? No, nobody cares how many hours a week I work, do they? So do you get the job done? That's what an exempt employee is, because I meet one of those 6 categories, right? Nobody cares how much you work. Child labor, I'm not going to spend a whole ton of time on this because I do want to get to some calculations before we break today. But you need to kind of go through and look at what the child labor laws are. There's nothing really to talk. There's not creative application of it. It's just a set of rules. If you're 16 and 17, you can do different things than if you're 14 or 15. You can't do a whole bunch of stuff till you're 18, hazardous materials, dangerous machinery, et cetera, et cetera. Kids as young as 10 and 11, this is a attestation to the really strong agricultural corporate ag lobby we have in this country. Kids all the way down to 10 and 11 can hand harvest in this country. Okay? That's your thank you to Monsanto's and your big corporate ag. Wage theft and penalties, blah, 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 don't violate FLSA. Okay, what the FLSA does not cover, a lot of people think these are their rights. You do not need to be paid for holidays or vacations. If your employer says, I don't pay you for any holidays, they're not breaking the law. They don't need to give you holidays, vacation time, sick leave. None of that is required by the Fair Labor Standard Act. Those are all benefits. And people really forget that in this country. Those are benefits. They do not have to give you one single solitary hour of any of that. Okay, how do you figure out what you have to pay somebody for? You have to pay them if they're prepping at their workstation. So I come in, I'm a fry cook at Denny's, and we don't start serving breakfast till 6, but I come in at 5:30 and start my grill up. I've got to be paid from 5:30 to 6. I travel. I'm a home health aide, and I go from client to client to client. They don't have to pay me from leaving my house to getting to my first client, but then they have to pay me between all my clients. Okay, travel time. Idle time, I work on a line and my line goes down and they're coming to calibrate it or do some, maintenance or QC on it, they got to pay me for it. Okay, this is another thing people don't realize. You do not need to be given breaks. That is not required by the FLSA. People seem to think that's a right. It is not. However, what the FLSA does say is that if your break is less than 20 minutes, they can't make you check out. Okay, they don't have to pay you for mealtime unless you've got some sort of inability to leave your workstation. Like, hey, you don't really need to work over your lunch, but you can't leave the front desk. Well, baloney. If it's non-compensable time, I should be able to go run an errand, right? If you work at home, like you stuff envelopes or what's that called? Transcription or something like that. You're by nature a non-exempt employee. They have to pay you overtime. Sleep time, like say you work at an Alzheimer's unit or a youth homes or something where they pay you for safety purposes, they pay for somebody to come in and spend the night, right? So you're sleeping during your job, so to speak. They've still got to pay you if your principal activity is to be on site. They've got to pay you for training sessions if it's required. They've got to pay you to wait to take a urinalysis, doctor's appointment. Okay, you've got to keep really good timesheets. I'm just kind of flying through this because, again, I want to get to some of these calculations. I'm not going through all this. We all know how to keep time. In the new day and age, a lot of it's digitized. In some more sophisticated places, they take retina scans, thumbprints, handprints, biometrics, things like that. Okay, so first off, this is a slide that you absolutely need to know inside and out. Actually, let me pull this up. There's 4 basic ways to pay. I can pay you every day if I want. I can pay you once a year if I want. Okay, but that's silly. There's 4 basic ways to pay. What's one of them? Bi-weekly. If I pay you bi-weekly, how many times a year do I pay you? 26. I pay you every other Thursday. So 10 months a year you get 2 paychecks. And 2 months a year you get 3 paychecks because it falls exactly in the calendar where you get paid 3 times. So you get paid 26 times a year. Bi-weekly. What else? How else can you be paid? Monthly. How many times a year? 12. How else? Weekly. How many times a year? 52. One other common one. Semi-monthly. This is the one that causes people angst. This is not every other week. It's not the same as bi-weekly. What is semi-monthly?
15th and the last day of the month.
Exactly. I pay you the 15th and the last day of the month. Or I pay you the 10th and the 25th of each month. Okay, so it's 20, how many times a year? 24. Obviously what students get confused is semi-monthly and bi-weekly. Okay, so one more time. Bi-weekly is how many times? 26 times a year. And bi-weekly, or semi-monthly is 24 times a year. Great. Okay, and that's all this slide says. Here's the next slide that we're going to be married to. How do you calculate pay for someone that's salaried and non-exempt? Remind me again what a non-exempt employee is. They're not exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standard Act. Now, this is going to look a touch different what I'm going to say from the book or from the slides. But it's easy to make the transition, so just bear with me. If you do these 5 steps, regardless of the data I throw at you, you will always come up with the right answer. Number 1, what do I mean when I say annualize the salary?
Find out how much they get paid in a year.
What do they get paid in a whole year? Number 2, calculate regular gross. They tell you here calculate regular weekly gross. I think you just calculate the regular gross because you don't divide by 52 if they're paid 24 times a year. Calculate their hourly pay. This you need to put a big asterisk by. The way that I want you to calculate hourly pay is to go back up to the annual salary and divide by the number of hours in the year. Can you fairly quickly calculate for me how many hours are in a full-time work year if I work 40 hours a week?
28.
So everybody make that calculation. How many hours are in a full-time work year?
2,080.
How'd you get that?
52 times 40.
52 weeks times 40 hours. 2,080. So to get my annual wage, if I make 30 grand, you take 30 grand divided by 2,080 hours, right? You can't always just throw that number in though, because some people don't work 40 hours a week. Their contract is for 37 a week. Or my contract's for 1,560 hours a year. So when you do my hourly wage, you'd have to divide by 1,560, right? So you can't just throw in 2,080, you gotta ask the question, do you work 40 hours a week, right? And then once you have their hourly pay, can you calculate overtime rate pretty easy? Yeah, just 1.5 times whatever that is. And then all you need to do is add their overtime pay to their regular gross. Now, we're going to go practice one, and I want you to write out all 5 of these algebraic statements. Okay, so the first one is, just a second, I want to see, I don't know why that all comes up so fast. Okay, the first one is, you can write these facts down on your piece of paper. I'm quoted a salary of $1,500 a month. I'm paid weekly. And I worked 43 hours last week. And I'm non-exempt. Step 1. What's step 1? Annualize the salary. Write down the algebraic equation, please, to annualize my salary. Write down the equation to annualize my salary. What do I have to multiply 15 by? What if I told you that that salary was quoted as a semi-monthly salary? Then what would you have to multiply by? 24. Good. So the point is, this number is dependent on what I'm quoted my salary for. Step 2 says what? Calculate regular gross. How are you going to do that? Yeah. How often, this one is how often are you paid? What's that number? 346.15. And again, I'm highlighting in red the numbers that change based on the data. Step 3 tells you to do what? Calculate the calculate the hourly wage. I told you how to do that. So you go back up to step 1 and pull the annualized. I want you to write these formulas down in your paper. How much does he make an hour? $8.65. And can you please label this? What that $8.65 is his what?
Per hour.
Regular rate. It's not his overtime rate, it's his regular rate. Step 4, calculate his overtime rate.
Where do you get that?
How did I figure out the number of hours in a full-time work year? What times what?
40 times
40 times 52. What I was saying earlier is you can't always plug that in, because what if I told you that I'm commissioned for 38 hours a week? And you'd have to recalculate that 2080, wouldn't you? Step 4, calculate the overtime rate. Anyone got the number? 1290. And what am I going to label that? OT rate. Yeah. Step 5. So I've gotten how much I got to pay him overtime. I've gotten his regular gross. Now what do I have to do? Write out the algebraic equation. There's 2 pieces to it. One part of it's in parentheses. What's his regular gross? What's his overtime? How do I calculate that? What times what?
865, or 1298 times 40.
Excellent. Because how many hours of overtime did he have? How much is his gross paycheck? $385.09, yeah? What time we got? 47?
Yeah, that top is right.
Oh, okay. All right, let's start this one, and then I'm going to have you finish it. Okay, here's the facts. On the last paycheck, I had 4 hours of OT. You've got time to do the first 2 steps. Annualize his wages, and then find his regular gross paycheck.
Where's the second one?
Semi-monthly. What does step 1 ask me to do? Annualize. How am I going to annualize the salary for this person? What times what? That's my annual salary. Step 2 asks me to do what? Calculate regular gross pay. The slide says regular weekly gross, but, and I'm not going to even go into why, then you have to treat it 2 different ways depending upon 2 different pay types. So I just do it the same way so that you just have 5 steps to memorize regardless. Step 2, figure regular gross paycheck. So I'm going to start with the annual salary, and this time I've got to divide by what? Do you see how these numbers aren't the same? I'm quoted my salary on a monthly basis, but how often am I paid may or may not be the same. Okay. Last thing, number 3, and then you're out of here. What's my hourly wage? Figure out my hourly wage, my regular hourly wage.
How do you figure it out?
No, I want you to figure it out. I know how to figure it out. How many hours a week am I commissioned to work? Unless you hear otherwise, you have to assume what? 40. How many weeks a year do I work? Yep.
So it's always 50.
It's always, unless I tell you differently, which I will be. Okay. 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 I'm sure your calculator doesn't lie. All right. Again, this is the number you use unless you hear something differently. And what is this again, Rebecca?
1154,
And what am I going to label it?
regular rate.
Very good. For Thursday, I want you to go, please, and work through, we've done examples 1 and 2. Okay, never mind. Yeah, all you need to do for Thursday is if you haven't read the chapter, please do so. We will continue to lecture on it, and then we'll start on homework for chapter 2 next week. Okay? Have a great snowy day.